Perhaps I'll end by saying he foresaw a future in which the rise of China, and therefore for us in Hong Kong, the implications would change the world. And I'm so delighted to have him here today to reflect on his book, but also his acute understanding as someone who's a student of history and a commentator, a media spokesperson, etc., to share his views, many of which were described in his book and were also rather prescient. Perhaps even he didn't anticipate the changes that were going to take place in the world. So Martin, over to you, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, Chandran. Actually, it's a real privilege and a great pleasure to be invited to give this opening keynote. As Chandran said, actually the first place I landed in 1993 was Hong Kong, and I did live there for a short time, and I followed it with great interest over a period, initially with great hope, and then with a rising sense, I suppose, to be honest and frank about it, of disappointment. And I really welcome this discussion, this initiative. I'm delighted that the Commissioner of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, is supporting it. I think what we need in Hong Kong, especially at the moment, or around the question of Hong Kong, are new conversations, new dialogues, because basically we, I think, ended up with a bit of a crash, actually, in Hong Kong. And so we need to think again about the way Hong Kong should evolve. And my remarks are going to be focused on Hong Kong, although, as you'll see from time to time, I'll be talking about China and the West, of course. I personally was a great supporter of the idea of one country, two systems, and I still am. But I think it proved to be much more difficult than probably anyone anticipated, and I would say than China anticipated, is my view. But the idea of one country, two systems is, especially and uniquely Chinese. I mean, it comes from the playbook of the civilization state, the notion that a very different notion to that of the nation state which presides in the West, that in a large country characterized by many differences, then you need to have diversity of forms across that territory. But it didn't quite work out in the way that we might have hoped. Why? Well, let me put this in three parts. Firstly, the Western attitude. Secondly, if you like, the Hong Kong attitude. And thirdly, the Chinese approach. Now, the Western approach, I think, to one country, two systems was essentially two systems. It paid scant respect or acknowledgement of the question of Chinese sovereignty. It was never discussed. And I think essentially the Western view was that Hong Kong should, as far as possible, given that, should continue exactly as it always had been under British colonialism. And it basically adopted, for example, in my own country, the UK, a highly critical stance, almost from the word go, always skeptical of China, always criticizing China for not honoring the agreements and so on. By the way, never talking about Hong Kong's colonial legacy, never. It was virtually never mentioned. Even the word colonial was barely mentioned. And I think, therefore, the Western attitude was not to wish Hong Kong success, but to try and secure a continuity with the past. And that was essentially the approach. And of course, this was a big block. This was a break. It had affected opinion in the West, of course, profoundly, but also affected opinion in Hong Kong. Now, the second problem question is the attitude of in Hong Kong. Not everyone, because it's never everybody, but I'm going to talk in generalities, if you'll excuse me. I think that Hong Kong had never really thought about these questions. It was, I think, by and large, the Hong Kong population was stuck in the past. It didn't see the way the world was changing. It didn't see or understand or embrace the rise of China. It didn't, I think, acknowledge the decline or even see the decline of the West. In other words, the extraordinary things that were already underway at the time of the handover in 1997, and which have absolutely been crucial to global change and change in the region and so on, since then were by and large unacknowledged. And so, you know, I remember being involved in a debate, if I can say this, in London in, I don't know, 2012, IQ squared debate. And Anson Chan was there, and she spoke at some length on China. And what I can remember is how extraordinarily ignorant she was about China. She just didn't know about China. She spoke as if China was still in the Mao era, and not the huge change that had been taking place. Even the economy seemed to be mainly stuck in that previous period. And I think that was perhaps an extreme illustration of the problem, but certainly it is an illustration of the situation. Now, the other thing I need to emphasize here is, and this is a big problem, and that is basically, and I was living in Hong Kong from 1998 to 2001, that many Hong Kongers looked down on China, looked down on the Chinese, regarded them to be inferior. And I think that's a huge problem. It was, if you like, a kind of racist mentality. And that was a big obstacle for Hong Kong engaging in the kind of full-hearted cooperation which was necessary with China in the new era. I mean, the other problem is that, by and large, also Hong Kong looked down on the rest of the region. I mean, my wife was Malaysian, you know, I had a lot to do with Malaysia and so on. I was always struck by the sort of dismissive attitude that many had towards the rest of the region. You know, Hong Kong walked on water, and no one else did in quite the same way. I think this was a serious problem. So a kind, look, let's use the word hubristic, a hubristic mentality in Hong Kong. Now, the third problem I want to mention in this context is, of course, and I understand this, Hong Kong didn't look north. It looked down on the Chinese. It looked west. It had been a British colony for 156 years. That leaves deep marks. That's a long period, many, many generations. And therefore, Hong Kong connections were always westward. The mentality was westward, and so on. And to break with that attitude is not going to happen, even with events moving as they were, quickly or for quite a long time in any profound way. But that's a real problem, because actually Hong Kong was already anachronistic at that moment in its outlook, in terms of coming to terms with and addressing the world as it already was, or certainly dramatically was becoming. Now, the third question is the Chinese attitude. And I think that basically I'd be very critical of the Chinese attitude in 1997, with hindsight. China's attitude was, I think, great pleasure in the handover. I mean, of course, you know, China barely had a foreign policy victory for so much historical time. And so finally, finally, the reunification of China in the form of the relationship with Hong Kong had been achieved. And I think the Chinese attitude was basically to show, in particular the West, that it would be a good guardian of Hong Kong. And so I think from the outset, the Chinese thinking about Hong Kong and one country, two systems was to emphasize continuity. And therefore, the consequence of this was what I would describe as a relatively passive position, a passive attitude. Don't touch it too much. I mean, contrary to the Western criticism of China, the opposite, in my view, is true. China sat on its hands too much. Now, of course, if it had been more proactive, which I think it should have been, that would have brought more Western criticism. But so be it. This was China's great responsibility now. Hong Kong was part of China. Now, what did this mean? What was the problem in practice? I think the assumption was that, Hong Kong was okay. It had been very successful in certain terms. It had become very prosperous, and so on. But I think in making this kind of superficial analysis, what was missed was actually the profound problems of Hong Kong, the colonial legacy of Hong Kong. In the West, Hong Kong was lauded as a competitive economy. Excuse me, Hong Kong was not a competitive economy. It was in certain areas, but it was essentially an oligopolistic economy, typical colonial economy, dominated by a number of small conglomerates. It was not competitive. It belonged to the typical colonial style economy, and it needed reforming. It needed to be made competitive. It needed to be made more meritocratic than it was. Then, of course, there was the problem of land and the stranglehold of a handful of tycoons, if you call them that, on the land, on the supply of land, on land prices, on therefore property prices. What was done about this? Well, there were one or two efforts, but ultimately precious little was done about this. And yet this was absolutely crucial issue in Hong Kong. Real estate occupies a special position in the context of Hong Kong. But even the administration, let's be honest about it, even the administration, of course, that was inherited from the British was a colonial style administration. Legco, Exco, all this. This was a colonial administration. And actually, what was needed was a reform program in Hong Kong. But the Hong Kong administration, to be frank about it, was incapable of developing, creating, and carrying through any serious reform program. It was basically still prey to the same kind of vested interests that had dominated for so long in Hong Kong. And of course, the other point I should add is this is a very unequal society. Hong Kong is one of the most unequal societies in the world, and it remains one of the most unequal societies in the world. So there's a lot of people in Hong Kong that do badly, but they, of course, they by and large historically have never been talked about. And this is a very big problem in Hong Kong. Well, ultimately, a situation of one country, I think what happened in a way with one country, two systems, was it was a stagnation, but also a form of paralysis. And it became a major political football. China not really emphasizing very much. I mean, of course, it recognized the importance of one country. That was very basic, but it gave relatively equal voice to the idea of two systems. And the West, on the other hand, was only talked about two systems. And ultimately, I think this situation, Hong Kong stagnated, then there was growing dissatisfaction among sections of the people, living standards, especially amongst the young, prospects declining and so on. And you got 2014 and then, of course, 2019. And that was the ultimate rupture. I mean, the truth is that in that old form from 1997, one country, two systems was unsustainable. I mean, that is what happened. it broke down. And so a profound rupture was now needed, a different kind of approach. And it's there that my optimism about Hong Kong kicks in, because I think that a very different attitude, a very different approach is now possible in Hong Kong. And I would make 5 points in this context in conclusion. First of all, of course, you can't run a country when it's split in the profound way that Hong Kong was split. So everything was contested and the argument didn't move on. The problems of Hong Kong were never seriously addressed and so on. And so, the new political system in Hong Kong is a system which says, starting point, Chinese sovereignty. Chinese sovereignty. Chinese sovereignty. This has been hugely neglected one way or another. Of course, from the West, never wanted to really acknowledge it. But also, in general, it was the future of Hong Kong is as part of China, a special part of China, but it is part of China. And secondly, of course, the security problem became completely out of, it became ridiculous. And by the way, I must say, China made a lot of mistakes, but, the period in 2019, the Western media was a disgrace, and the Western politicians, because they never, ever criticized the violence that they would never tolerate in their own large cities. They would immediately clamp down on it and repress it, because a modern society cannot tolerate that. But all the criticism of the police, never about the sheer level of violence in Hong Kong. So I think that this creates now this new approach of a security legislation, and in particular the new political system are based on a consensus about the future of Hong Kong, is a fundamental prerequisite. Now, the third point I want to make in this context is that Hong Kong needs a reform program. It's not had a reform program since 1997. There was no reform program. There's nothing equivalent to what transformed China under Deng Xiaoping from 1978 onwards. There's been nothing like that. And so the problems of Hong Kong have festered and worsened and intensified. And so I think that the new administration in Hong Kong has to set this as the central goal, the central priority. The dissatisfaction in Hong Kong is not primarily about China and the Chinese. That is a problem. But the primary problem is the socio-economic problems facing the people that have not been addressed in a way that brings them on side. Property prices, creating a land reform, creating a competitive economy, broadening that economy. Do you know, Hong Kong, 7.4 million people, is not just about the financial sector and real estate. It needs to be broadened. Look north of the border, look at Shenzhen. That's a much more balanced and diverse economy, and Hong Kong has to think in these terms as well. The question of inequality, it's intolerable to have such a high level of inequality. So those are the poorer sections of the population, what they do, what their jobs are, what their rights are, and so on, needs to be addressed. And what I'm talking about here is the great task now facing China and the Hong Kong administration is winning the hearts and minds of the Hong Kong people. Until now, that has not been achieved. That is absolutely central task now. My fourth point is the relationship with China. Look, integration with China, the relationship between Hong Kong and the Greater Bay Area is the future of Hong Kong. The relationship with Guangdong province is the future of Hong Kong. And you've only got to look north of the border of what can be achieved and what has been achieved. I mean, the transformation of Shenzhen, which I remember first visiting, way back in the 90s, and it was then, sort of Wild East. It is quite remarkable that, the great alternative to Silicon Valley is now in the Greater Bay Area. And so the extent to which Hong Kong can interact with and develop with China. China is very, very important. I mean, one of the great problems has been this aversion, if you like, to cooperation with China, which relates to the points I made culturally about Hong Kong earlier on. But also the administration's been, you know, let's be frank about it. The Hong Kong administration has been averse to cooperation with China. That era is over now. It must be, because Hong Kong's future rests with this creating, and it's a very creative project and a very demanding project, a new kind of relationship with China. And of course, you've always got to bear in mind, look, in 1997, Hong Kong was 18% the size of the Chinese economy. 25 years later, it's around about 2%. I mean, there's been a huge shift, you know. So anyone who couldn't see which way the world was going in 1997 would be absolutely blind if they can't see it in 2022. It is obvious. And this is, look, let's face it, this is an historic opportunity for Hong Kong to be located again next to the fastest growing, and now more or less with the United States, the largest market in the world. I mean, you could put it another way, couldn't you? You could say, well, actually, well, I don't like thinking of it like this, but in the 1840s, when the British conquered, won the war and the Opium Wars and so on, is one of the most disgraceful episodes in British colonial history. But, you know, in a way, you can look at it perversely and say, well, Hong Kong got lucky because the West was on the rise and China was on the decline, and was on the decline for the next century. And now look what's happened. Hong Kong is now on the, you know, has this tremendous chance for a relationship with China, a new creative, dynamic relationship, and it has to seize this opportunity. And my final point is this: the biggest problem is cultural. It's not economic, it's cultural. Can Hong Kong understand the nature of the world as it is now? Can Hong Kong reinvent itself for the times in which we live? The old identity of Hong Kong and the way in which Hong Kong was thought, which I outlined at the beginning, that there is no future for Hong Kong like that. There is no future. Hong Kong has to rethink its coordinates with the world. It has to not look west. I'm not against having a relationship with the West. Of course, that can be very useful, important. But the key relationship is not to the West. It is to the north. And Hong Kong has to creatively address this question. Hong Kong needs to be reinvented, and the Hong Kong identity has to be reconceived. The old identity is over. It is backward looking. And to be quite blunt about it, historically speaking, it's bankrupt. Thank you very much.
Let me just take a second to thank Martin for a wide-ranging and profound introduction to set the scene for not just this conference, but the entire series. Thank you, Martin. And I hope that puts to bed the idea that you are anti-Western and only pro-China or something like that. But your very balanced and honest description, based on having lived here too, I think gives us a lot of food for thought. Thank you so much.